We have 4 between now and December, and the poster for that will be coming out soon. But we have a really nice variety of speakers who are going to come in and do these Trompe lunches once a month this semester. I also wanted to invite you to our reception in the School of Social Work. I know I've told many of you this, but some of you might not have heard. This Thursday evening, which is September 11th, from 5 to 7 on the 4th floor of Percy, we're having an art exhibit and reception. So there'll be wine and snacks and an artist's exhibit there, and we'd like to invite all of you to come and kind of kick off the semester with us there in the School of Social Work. So my name is Lori Power, I think everybody knows that, and I'm happy to introduce to you today Bruce St. Thomas, and I'm just going to tell you a little bit about him, and then we'll get right to the conversation. I'm going to be waving at Bruce partway through the conversation so that he knows how much time he has, and then try to leave a little time at the end for questions. So keep that in mind. But here we have Bruce, who EDD and all kinds of other letters.
Too many.
Who will discuss his diverse therapeutic approaches to trauma, grief, and life transition as utilized at America's Camp, which is a place for children who lost a parent or a sibling as a result of the attacks on September 11th, 2001. Dr. St. Thomas has taken an in-depth creative approach to trauma, grief, and life transition from his psychotherapy, art therapy practice into community settings, where he has both created and consulted to implement innovation and peer-supported programs. He helped create the multicultural program at the Center for Grieving Children in Portland. He has helped with creative, supportive community-based programs with the Department of Health and Human Services, Baxter School for the Deaf, and America's Camp, which, as we said, was a camp for children whose parents were killed in the tragic events of 9/11, and for children or siblings of firefighters and law enforcement officers who were lost in the line of duty. So please join me in welcoming Dr. St. Thomas.
Thank you. And thank you very much, Lori, for inviting me to be here, and I feel honored to be the first person speaking in your series of presentations. And Lori, if you would, to just pass those out to people. You're going to be getting 3 sheets. You don't need to pay attention to them right now, but they have images on them, and I'll refer to those images as I move along in my talk. So you don't need to look at them right now, but you can use them as reference. I'm honored to be here, and several things go through my mind. I'd like to introduce just some conceptual thoughts to start with about how I moved into community programs and why, and just a quick theoretical notion from the literature about where things are today in community-based healing projects, America's Camp being one of them. And there's a great deal of learning that's taken place over the years, and I think for me, the initial piece that started my career in action was I was in the Army during the Vietnam War. And at that time, we talked about shell shock and battle fatigue and R&R, and there was no mention of PTSD and no understanding really of how PTSD was a major factor in terms of people's injuries as well as their recovery. But very quickly, I'm just going to give you a quick example. One of my very primary experiences that I'll never forget, I was a 91G20, which is a mental health technician assigned to psychiatrists in Brooke General Hospital in San Antonio, and then Second General Hospital you hear a lot about in the European Command. And this is where a lot of people come directly from Vietnam to those medical centers for treatment and for support. I worked with quad amps and burn patients, things that I'll never forget in my life. But it points out my resiliency-based training from day one, and that is that when a quad amp would be directly medevac from Vietnam, and they would land at Brooke General Hospital within so many hours from the injury, still in a state of shock, it was our duty and responsibility to find someone who loved this person immediately. So we had to get on the phone, call home, find a girlfriend, find a father, find a mother, someone with a significant relationship. And if we couldn't, it was probably 90% the fact that this person would die. So the lesson in all of that work, which was really crisis-based work, working as fast as you could, and really the person did not become aware that their limbs were missing. I think there was a 48-hour rule or something like that before you become totally aware of what has happened, before the shock is over. At that point, having someone near you, there was the ability to find meaning in the struggle, because there was someone there to remind you that you were really loved and cared for. And it was critical. It was the most critical work I've probably ever done. So that taught me a very primary lesson, resiliency. That resiliency in this work is something that we have to pay close attention to, and that resiliency is internal to the problem. That it wasn't about anything outside that could be offered. It was really finding some way of finding something inside that could give this person meaning in the journey of recovery. So that started my work. It was fast-paced. I got valuable lessons from that. Came out, and of course I had been attached to psychiatry, so I was always attached to psychiatric facilities or psychiatrists. In fact, my practice, which has just been sold, we had a senior psychiatrist working with us. And I think the reason for that that was so appealing to me is, and of course that's not, now psychiatrists are really into, kind of the administration of medications, et cetera, but Joan Larkin, who was a psychiatrist in our group, was still psychoanalytically trained. So the work in psychiatry was really to pay attention to the unconscious, the subconscious, the inner workings of where people were coming from. And it was one of the things I believed deeply in. So because of the earlier work, I soon became on track with trauma, complicated grief, trauma recovery with children, families, medical situations, psychological situations, and the like. And I think the greatest lessons I learned were from children. Children are resilient in the most amazing ways. We know that medically and physically, but they are psychologically. And when I first entered this field, the expressive therapies were called, and I wish they still use the term, the action therapies. So action is central to the work, and now we know in trauma recovery that action is critical. We're an action organism. Our traumas and our life experiences and our emotions are locked into our bodies. David Saran Schreiber from I think it's in Paris, France, a French psychiatrist, actually did research and neuro research and looked at the fact that when people say, I feel it on my back, it's in my neck, I'm carried in my gut, my body is tired, my soul is weak, that is true, that we carry these emotional impressions in our body and in our muscular tissue, and it is real. So it became very, very critical to know that in fact the body is the mode of expression. And when I think about all the work I've done with families, with children, with groups, with community-based work, it's always about engaging the body. It's always about moving into action, some kind of interaction. And of course, creativity is really connected to that. Our voice, music, movement, dance, art, imagery are all body-centered pieces of work. So that was the piece that made the most sense to me, and children would be willing to go there. So if you look at a continuum, our pain and our sorrow is on the same continuum as our joy and our excitement. So children will go for play even when it takes them to difficult and painful places. And so I really gained a great deal of wisdom from children. They may not be wise in their life experience. They are knowledgeable about how life works. And they are especially knowledgeable about transformation because they go directly to the material to play it out until there is resolution. And resolution is an internally driven experience rather than being directed from the outside. So I've experienced story after story, but I won't get into them because I know I need to be mindful of time. I really began to do a lot of research, a lot of writing of articles, publications. The most recent book that I'm the senior author of with Paul Johnson from the University of Southern Maine is Empowering Children Through Art and Expression, Culturally Sensitive Approaches to Trauma and Grief. And it looks at, 3 of those programs. It looks at America's Camp, the Center for Grieving Children and Refugee Immigrant Program, and it looks at the HHS program, which is people who are moving from welfare aspire to work opportunities, and I'm a mental health consultant to that program. What I soon learned and began to make a lot of sense to me is that there's something more going on, and it's really something we don't get a lot of explanation of in our coursework or our theory books. We learn a lot about trauma-based theory and PTSD, but we don't do a lot of, at least have it, maybe I'm false in what I'm saying, but collective trauma. Collective trauma has become a more recent research item, but collective trauma begins to make sense of what people go through, especially in mass trauma like 9/11, events of that sort, wars, Iraq, World War II, any number of events that have occurred in our history, the Holocaust, etc. And so Erik Erikson was the first to come up with theories about this, and it was actually after a flooding disaster in small mining communities in Buffalo Creek, Virginia. And he basically observed that when people lost their homes, sometimes parts of their family, their geography, their community, that there was a loss of a separation from social context, and that there began to be problems, difficulties in caring for others. What we would see as a natural pattern of bonding and attachment started to be skewed. That there was a loss of meaning and connection to themselves, depression, anxiety, other kinds of things that came up, a blow to the tissue of social life. And obviously we see that in lots of arenas, and we see it in the Middle East, we see it in all the skirmishes that are occurring worldwide, we see it in Africa and continents that are going through a lot of conflict. But I want to just make a quick point that we've seen it as humanity forever. This is part of our foundation in being human. So that not only are we able to locate collective trauma in world communities regarding terrorism, 9/11, racism, genocide, refugee status, wars, political upheaval, but we can quickly begin to reference the not-so-distant past. The sources of collective trauma are related to the Holocaust, desecration and annihilation of Native and Indigenous people, and their understanding across all world nations, world wars, slavery, colonialism, poverty, and abuses of human rights that exceed all possible descriptions. They're here. They're in our country. They're in our history. We sit on the land in which they occurred. So there's no nation nor people that are removed from tragedy, and collective trauma requires something different. And what I really am here to share with you is that it really requires collective healing. And the notions of collective healing are really propagated by shamans and imams and spiritual leaders across the world who have known long before us that collective healing is one of the essential and necessary paths to recovery. There's one other study I just want to reference. It's the Hobfall research, and it's a worldwide panel of experts that began to look at what happened to people who were exposed to disaster, mass violence, and to extrapolate from various fields to come up with a common reference of the things that needed to occur for healing to take place. And one is to promote a sense of safety, promote calming, promote a sense of self and collective advocacy, promote connectedness, and to promote hope. Now, those would all make sense to all of us. When we don't start a group, in group practice, we don't really start a therapeutic process with an individual without gaining some sense of safety and some sense of calming and well-being and connection. So these are sort of the human standards that really are requirements to re-enter into some sense of wellness and wholeness, some sense of recovery, and especially from mass trauma. These are these hub variables we are now using specifically at the Center for Grieving Children. I'm going to talk about my 10 years involvement with America's Camp and what's happened since this book, the second book, should be out in spring, I'm hoping, is really looking in more depth at the research and literature and the updates of the programs and experiences that we've had. But America's Camp well amplifies these concepts and this research, even though at that point, I wasn't there, I wasn't really digging into that arena. But understanding that there was something collective going on in that camp was unmistakable. And there was a factor right from the beginning that was being recorded in some of the publications and articles in the New York Times about the salient, what they call the salient factor, and that was that at America's Camp, the connection was palpable. That you could feel a sense of its culture, of the group of children and camp, facilitators, and certainly, and I was speaking to Lori earlier, my experience was that it was a privilege and an honor to be there. Let me give you some sense of the size of the camp and the structure. There were 370 to, probably that was our highest, 380 children at a time. There were camp counselors, counselors in each of the bunkhouses, 2 or 3 in the bunkhouses. They came from all over the world and volunteered. It was funded by the Twin Towers Fund. The directors were leading directors from across the country. There were other, there was the bead lady that everyone loved, the carpenter shop, the clay house. I mean, these children had the best of the best. They were taken to, the Baseball Hall of Fame, the Basketball Hall of Fame, concerts live on campus. It was sort of dazzling in the beginning. And it was really a frank and very difficult encounter between camp directors. The Center for Grieving Children was engaged. We brought volunteers down to the camp. We set up what was called Buddy Central. Buddy Central was open for drop-in at any point from any of the campers. And grief facilitators were available to go to any of the bunkhouses at any time. I was seen as a psychological consultant, and I worked with other consultants within the camp. In fact, for 3 years, Marie Sheffield, who's the director of the program at the Center for Grieving Children, the multicultural program, was co-facilitator with me in that camp. Lots and lots of lessons, lots of experiences, but I want to take you through it. There's another key player, and it's Tracy Malloy. Tracy Malloy is from New York. She's an artist in residence. She does social advocacy art, and so she was there as well. So we had a lot of creative people, a lot of things going on in camp. But one of the first things that we became aware of was that the children had their own direction of where they needed to go. And we had to start following their lead. We had to begin to understand what it was that they felt needed to be created. And even though all the bunks were pouring into the field house where the art was being done, we began to get from the art actual direct information from the children as to the next piece of art that they wanted to engage in. I mean, it was really fascinating. So that first year, actually, the center, and I was part of that, had brought down the concept of building a quilt together. And to give you a sense of the size and magnitude, and you're looking at, on your sheet at, just quilt pieces, and you see the full quilt. That picture was taken at the Pentagon, and I'll tell you more about that. But the size of these objects were huge, and these art, they were community-based art experiences, were used for our closing ceremony. So the children not only built them and viewed their energy in it, and had memoriam messages to the people that they had lost, but these pieces were used as part of the ritual of closing at camp. And that closing included, the spiritual director of the camp, some counselors from New Zealand who did the hookah and would pound their chests and open the energy for the closing rituals, and on and on and on. The magnitude was huge. So our closing rituals would probably, in most instances, engage 400 to 450 people. So major community events. What happened in that first piece of art, which was called the Quilt Slam, and that was in 2003. There were 300 squares that went into the quilt. And many of the events that were depicted, came directly from the trauma itself. This was year 2 of the camp. So year 1 had not had an art project. This was year 2. The stripes on my father's shirt, loved ones' initials, poems, representations of heaven, sports images. These are sort of the big themes that come across. Last time I remember being with my mother, my father, my uncle, my brother, hoop shooting with Dad, sports events that we went to, and the outcome of the messages in that first quilt piece were, joyous and sorrowful and appreciative and angry and optimistic. Kids were wearing, insignias from their fathers and mothers' departments, police badges, picture identities. There wasn't a child you passed in that camp that didn't have, their father or their parents' picture on the front of their T-shirt or something personal from that person that they were wearing that first summer. We found that themes were emerging in the camp, that each year that the children came, that would come directly from that. And year 1 was identifying with the person we lost. What did they do? Where did they work? What department did they come from? And the communication of that was buzzing around the campus. The collision course with the camp directors was basically, their intention was the children will come here for a week, they will have the best experience of their life, and this will begin to ameliorate the pain they're carrying around this event. From the Center for Grieving Children and myself and other coordinates, we were saying, wait a minute, you get children engaged in fun and play activities, and up is going to come the pain. So what started happening around campus is that I would be part of huge debriefings, collisions, where children would, I remember one was Basketball Hall of Fame, and what people didn't understand was that 3 of the boys, that had been the last thing they did with their father. An event, at the Basketball Hall of Fame, a separate car to bring them back, everyone upset. So we kept saying and pointing out to the camp directors, this is not just a camp of celebration. This is also a camp of grief. And you need to recognize it and normalize it. And the camp counselors were begging for more and more support from us. Tell us, what do we do when they ask the unanswerable questions? We can't respond at night to what kids are saying. It was all over the campus. So by year 3, we were in it together. By year 3, everyone had accepted that this was a grief camp, along with being a camp of celebrating these children's lives, and that we would do everything we could to facilitate that process. What came up in the beginning and in a lot of the work are the Twin Towers, which had so much to do with the event itself, and we even had children who were media folk. They wanted nothing to do with any media information, the television, nothing. it had been so traumatic to see this event over and over again. Just to give you a quick snippet, back at Buddy Central, we have what's called the volcano room, and it's a room you can go in and do, gross motor activity and hit punching bags and, mattresses and batakas and things that can, get out energy at a physical level. And in that room, children were stacking mattresses and they were using the tubes. These were the plastic tubes that you use for, hitting and playing and acting things out into the mattresses to put oxygen into the towers so that people wouldn't die. That went on year 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So that tells you the magnitude and impact of this trauma and how physically we have to act these things out before they get integrated into our bodies, and how clear children were with the directive of this was the activity they wanted to do. That's just one of many examples. The Twin Towers were in the artwork. Kids were even accurate with the number of floors they had on the towers, etc., etc. This is, you see on your, it says a quilt letter, and in this letter, which you can't see, this is what this child wrote. Why wouldn't I want to talk about my father? He was a hero, said the daughter of the crumbling castles. I want to call out his name every opportunity I get. For every time I do this, I honor his memory. I celebrate his legacy and cherish all that he sacrificed for me and ensure that his torch shines on, even through the driving rain, even through the frigid winds, even in the eternal darkness of the present. He was my father, he is my father, and he will always remain in my heart. I'm going to go to another resource here. This book was created in Where Can I Get a Phoenix, and you'll understand the importance of the phoenix on my book cover and this book cover as one of the community-based projects. By the way, each of these projects are permanently installed at Ground Zero. So there is going to be a room dedicated to what happened with these children in the 10 years that they were there at camp. And I believe it's going to be called the Room of Hope. And I'll tell you some of the experiences we had at the Pentagon and other places when other communities become exposed to this material, because it's sacred. It's sacred material. This is John Burke. John Burke entered the program at age 7 and exited as an adolescent. And many of the children became counselors in training through the course of the time that they were in the program, which was just fabulous. Here's his poem, and this was toward the beginning of his time there. I was angry. He had been taken from me. Before he had a chance to say goodbye, I felt betrayed. He had gone after saying he would be there for me. I felt sad. I had lost someone who could never be replaced. I felt scared. I wanted to wake up and realize it was only a dream. I felt alone. He was gone, and I had no one else like him. I felt like there was no more hope. Now that he was gone, I was alone. But then I came here, and I realized I was not alone, that there were people who had felt the same way as me and thought that they were also alone. But they had realized that they were not alone the same way I had. And now none of us will never feel alone because we have each other. What happened, and I had mentioned this to you before, is that one of these community-based projects would lead into another. And so this was the second project, which was called the Sky Project. And you see it on your sheet, Sky Project, and it goes on to the second page with the Twin Towers image. The Sky Project came from the Quilt Slam, and the Quilt Slam had many images of the sky, the heavens above, galactic scenes, and children would talk about looking at the stars at night to talk to their dead parents. So they were giving us the message and the information. So year 2 went into the Sky Project, and that project was 42 by 2 foot panels. We covered, the length of this wall plus. And the project was hugely successful. Children talked about what their parents were doing in heaven. There were all kinds of messages and tributes to their parents in heaven. I remember one little girl put a scene of, because she always went bowling with her father, and she said, "I'll never be afraid of thunder again, because when I hear it, it's a strike, and my father's bowling in heaven." Just all of these associations that were just magical and beautiful and undescribable, just ways in which children were identifying. The next piece that was done was entitled Apollo's Ascent, and Apollo was the Greek god of the sun, music and healing. Apollo's brother Hermes was the messenger god. And this project was postcards as tributes of a special memory, an image, an icon representing America's camp, the school, home, or the deceased loved one. And they were to choose one of these icons and put a message on the other side, like writing a note from camp. And they wanted to send it directly up into the heavens. So we got permission for 4 weather balloons, and the day came for the closing ritual. And there was, we had thunderstorms every afternoon during that time period. It was, August, in Western Mass, and thunderstorms roll in the afternoon. And the clouds came in, and we made it to the parade ground, and the ritual started, and the poems were read, and the hookah was performed, and the blessings were given, and the children screamed, "Give us the ropes." So they lined up, and we had enough ropes so that all children could have their hands on the rope. And they decided when the balloons would be cut, and one of the balloons went up. Literally, the clouds parted. I've never seen, it was so mystical, it was unimaginable. The rain held back, the clouds parted, the blue sky came in, the balloons went up, and one of them lingered over all of us. And the children said, "It's our parents, and they're telling us, thank you, we're here for you." And as they did that, they basically screamed to the counselors and said, "Cut the ropes into bracelets, we'll wear them forever." And the ropes were cut and put them around their wrists. And the balloon went up into the afternoon sky, and the storm came in, and it was just, those were the kinds of events that you would have. And it was an energy event, and it was beyond belief. One of the balloons went down in New Jersey, and it went down in a policeman's yard, and a fireman, in Manhattan Fire Department. And they came in the year after with them and spoke to the children. And the children said it was a message, that their messages had been received. So there was never a dry eye in the field house, or when these things were performed, or when we had our closing rituals. The next was the Phoenix Rising. You see the Phoenix as an emblem on a lot of our books and literature. And the campers of the previous year had talked about the phoenix bird because the phoenix lives forever, even when it's burned. So the Greek mythology is when the phoenix is about to die, it bursts into flames, and then it's then reborn out of its own ashes. Its song is said to be so beautiful that Apollo stops pulling the sun to listen to the phoenix bird. Each child made a feather for the phoenix, and the feather was based on the person they wished to honor. And then the phoenix was covered with pillow varnish, and we went to the field house, and it was uncovered, and it glowed in the night, and went into the air, and all, you know, I don't know, what did we have, 270 kids, 400 counselors. The counselors created an egg that was left below, and in the egg was broken open by the children, and in the egg were 280 paper cranes, origami cranes, and the children were asked to unfold them, and they were heart messages from the counselors to them. Just, you know, the most amazing rituals that you could ever imagine. And so that was Phoenix Rising. The wingspan was 20 to 30 feet, and it's a huge piece of art. And it's monumental. This entire exhibit was put together and is being shown across the country. So it's in preservation, it's being held. It will eventually be at Ground Zero, but it was at the Norman Rockwell Museum at one point, and this was later in the camp's history. So we had basically, you know, the children who were in utero at the time the event occurred. And the children who started the camp were now the counselors. And we went into the Norman, we went into the Norman Rockwell Museum, and the children who are now counselors got onto their knees and greeted the youngest members of the families coming off the buses who knew nothing or knew only what they had heard about the event, and took them through their camp experience and the art rituals that were built through the years. So it became a documentary of their own humor. What began to rise in the camp were, by year 8, were feelings of hope, and the children were expressing it in their artwork and in their messages to each other. And so the last piece, which is the large piece on the end, is entitled Pandora's Lantern of Hope. And according to the Greek mythology, when Pandora was created, she was given numerous gifts by the gods. Aphrodite gave her the gift of beauty, Apollo gave her the gift of music and sound, and Hermes gave her the gift of persuasion. And she was also given a box by Zeus, who said she was never to open it. And of course we know the story, that curiosity took her to opening the box, and Zachary released all the evils onto the world, and the only item remaining inside the open box was hope. So this was the lantern of hope. And the spine of the lantern, which you can't see, is in the middle, is covered with and painted hundreds of names of individuals who provided support to the Children of America's camp. And each child created a visual interpretation of their hope on frosted mylar. So these are mylar panels that went into the lantern, coding the imagery in personal iconography. And then the powerful voice recordings of the children's voices emanate from the core of the lantern, and the children say the name of their deceased loved one, followed by what it is they hope for. So the lantern represents hope and love. And the way that that ritual occurred is that we went to the field house. Field house was darkened. The children's counselors tied around their neck a heart that each of them had made from clay at the bottom of the lake of the camp, and fired and painted. And then the light went on in the lantern inside, reflecting out, and their voices came out. And it was an amazing closing event. I'm going to read, am I okay, Tom? Yes. I'm going to read John Burke's last poem. The place I belong comes once a year for 1 week, where the rest of the world disappears. And popularity, school, stress, and every other issue from everyday life disappear with it. And a new place is created where anyone can be themselves without worrying about being criticized or scolded, about fitting in, without worrying about anything. The place I belong, the retreat from the everyday life for me and lots of other kids and adults, to our heaven on earth, to our perfect place, the place where I belong, America's camp. Now, the kids would talk about the fact that outside of camp they were the 9/11 kids, and inside the camp they were kids who had a chance to make friendships for life. And I'm sure they're going to know these friends for their lifetime, and that everything else they could let go of. So where are we here?
We're just-
Quarter off.
Good timing, actually.
Okay.
So we have time for a few questions.
Yeah, please, is there anything? I know that's a quick snapshot, but I wanted to take you in as much as I could to the experience of how really amazing this experience was. And kids would say, we can never describe outside of camp what happens within. Please.
What's the feedback from the parents that were left behind?
Well, left behind in terms of,
Were not killed in
oh,
9/11?
there was a ton. I mean, many of them wrote books. Many of them, many of these families were in therapy. There were lots of things, going on at home. One of the themes that came up in later phases of camp for children were their parents, finding someone else, meeting someone else, and mixed review on that from the kids, but it was happening. And oftentimes at camp, the parents would come at the end. I mean, many of the kids went by bus to New York, Boston, all over. And then sometimes the parents would come, like on a year when we did the quilt, it took all of the volunteers and everyone's effort with 2 nights, being up all night to sew that quilt, to get it together. I mean, it was just like beyond. And those were the things that would happen at camp. All of a sudden, something, boom, we go for it. But we were around that quilt with the families, holding it down because it was going. It was the most amazing event, it really was. But lots of changes were occurring at home that were very difficult for the children, very difficult for the parents. And I think mostly it was the fact that this was such a, it reminds me of that definition of collective trauma. It was such a rupture of their life. At a symbolic level, at a concrete level, at an emotional level, at a community level, just a complete rupture. And so the re-establishment of network and friends and connections, and there was a lot going on in New York at that time for these families. I don't know that I really answered you, just sort of my experience of being.
When the kids said outside of this camp, we're just known as the 9/11 kids,
They felt that way.
and what was that?
They hated that, Lori. It was, for them, it was a feeling that other people looked at them as if they had been through this event, so therefore they were different. But like a lot of traumas, there's little discussion or little connection around what did this mean, or what were they going through, or how would, and they really didn't want to talk to people about it. I mean, it kind of goes back to my opening remarks that I think most people in trauma, and especially collective trauma, do not want to talk about this. They really need to get into the material, but in a way that is safe and is built from their own voice of what they need to express. And that's what was happening at America's camp, but it wasn't happening at their school or at the places they had to publicly interface. And so they really didn't want any part of that. So there was a solidarity at camp that didn't exist other places. And there was a lot of networking and communicating going even when they went back to school, which was great. I mean, thanks for technology, it's fantastic. Does that
Yeah.
answer?
I was just thinking, the concept of collective trauma is a really helpful way to think about this, because if many children have lost a parent,
Right,
but nobody has lost a parent in 9/11 before. And
Exactly.
that's a new thing
Exactly.
that happened, that all of us felt a part of that in a way.
it's
We
a
all-
collective event.
Right, and we
Yeah.
all watched it, and we all
Yeah.
experienced the tragedy, and, but imagine a child who sees the whole world see their parent die.
Right. Yeah. In the year 2, one of the things that came up was, what were the last recorded messages?
Yeah.
Year 3, who has DNA evidence? Because there's no remains. I mean, it was just the most wrenching phenomena, to not have the body, or to not have, normal patterns that you go through around this grief. And those are things that they quickly could network and share, and were intimate details that everyone was comfortable with, talking about. It was great. I mean, for them to have that, it really was.
First, I have a question.
Yes.
And a little background, I did some work doing my internship this fall at the Cancer Care Center. We have a group down in Sanford, doing some work with
Okay.
groups down there. And this past summer, I did some work with the Androscoggin Home Care and Hospice for an event they did called Camp Dragonfly, which met with parents and families, and just gave them a day to kind of process grief, either the anticipation of losing someone or, a recent loss kind of thing. And we had a really remarkable day last June when we did that day. And so in looking at the diversity of the art projects that we came up with to kind of help these kids to tap into so many facets of what they were experiencing. Can you describe the process of determining how did you come up with that kind of,
Yes.
and I'm looking at this from a couple of perspectives. One, that the Camp Dragonfly was very successful, we want to do it again. I'm curious to see what they come up with next. But also in going ahead to doing this facilitating down in Sanford, I'd really like to be able to bring art into it. And don't want to necessarily just, limit it to art, as we think of it, the traditional art, but, I see this, the kids use poetry and writing, and, all kinds of different arts to come together. But going from a quilt to the lantern to, they're just so different. And so who's responsible for it? And
Well,
does that
it
make
was,
sense?
it was a collective responsibility. Tracy Malloy, we were going to the Art Buck all the time. So it became a venue for me in terms of getting the patterns on campus, what was going on with kids, and also to interact with groups, because the bunks would end up there doing the art piece. So it was almost like it was a group effort to really get in touch with where were the kids on camp and what was up for them. And the art was one of the expressive modalities that this came out of. What we built them on, and I tried to apply some of that, was that each year's event would give us clues in terms of where people needed to go. And those clues were embedded in the symbols they used. And those symbols, Tracy would, collate them, and we would sit down and go over, where do we have the highest percentage of symbols and interests from children. And it really directed the process. It was to the sky, and then to the message in the sky, and then, to the image of life after death. So it came from them, and that's my most important message really today, is that in all the work that I do, is that the critical piece is that even if people are entering different art expressions, it's important to collectively understand when you're working with a community about where that community needs to go. And they know that. They have some ideas of that. So the children were asked directly, we got information from their art, we could hear the buzz about campus, we had information from them. And I find that that's more and more the pattern of where I go. So it's really that any of the art forms can become the collective voice. A poem, a story, an image, images, a ritual. But the most important piece is, where do people want to go? And there is a collective voice in that, about where they need to go. And the result of images, or in this case, community-based art rituals and experiences, not only gives that a collective voice, but it gives it a product. And we're finding, like at the center, we have the artists in residence come in like the last 6 weeks of the program, because by then we know the children's voices. And it's rising in terms of things they've shared, the improvisational experiences we've had with them, the kinds of things they're talking about. And then the artist in residence brings in the art form in which that can become a part of. And it gives the children, we have an album that we've published, from children's works. It gives them a product that we feel is the cutting edge of social change. So, you get out there, like with America's Camp, this has produced social change, because these art products now are something people can encounter that they, in fact, are affected by. When we went to Washington and went to the Pentagon with the exhibit, it was for the families who had had the experience of the Pentagon. And of course that was limited in terms of the number of people affected, but they were greatly affected by this experience. And they said that when they had the chance to have this exhibit, and it was closed to the public, they had one event that just took the families and children of those people who were killed together. And they said it was the most healing event that they had experienced. So there's a tremendous amount of healing in the production of art. And there's a tremendous amount of resilience in our abilities to identify where we need to go. And I find that individually I work the same way. It's like, there's a concept that I use in my work that is, what is the meaning of your suffering? Because we suffer with pain, it's real. But finding the meaning of that is both an individual and, in this case, a collective journey. And it's real. Because when we do find the meaning of our suffering and of our healing, there is transformation. Children who were part of this program became the counselors in training, then became the counselors providing support for their younger siblings, and children, as I said, who were in utero, went on to Tuesdays programs. These are empowerment programs in New York that sponsor adolescents going to other countries where mass trauma has occurred. So there is tremendous hope when we bring people together. Now, I agree with the TLC program, the programs at the center. It's one of the reasons I love the center, because the center is a community-based healing project, and they believe that people's grief is their own, that there are beliefs in any traditions or religious practices or cultural differences, and that people have their own way of getting there, and that the facilitator is not the director. The facilitator supports the natural process. Did that help?
Yes, it does.
Good.
I'm
Thank you.
afraid we're out of time. I just want to
okay to go. But thank you so much, Bruce,
Thank
for
you.
speaking with us. It's really